Good afternoon. Oh, sorry. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to welcome you at our panel, side event. I hope that everyone after lunch have more power to spend 1 hour with us. My name is Yuri Sergeyev, and I am Arctic Project Advisor at Bellona Environmental Transparency Center, and I will be moderating today's discussion. At first glance, propaganda and the environment may seem like two separate issues, but in reality, they are deeply connected, especially in the current geopolitical situation. Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we have seen how disinformation has become a core instrument of the state policy. This affects not only military or political debates, but also environmental ones. Russia's state media actively promote narratives portraying the Arctic and especially the Northern Sea route as safe, economically viable, and environmentally sustainable. Decisions about shipping routes, extractive industries, and climate policy are shaped not only by data and scientific evidence, but also by narratives. And when those narratives are deliberately distorted, the consequences are not abstract. They affect ecosystems, they affect policy, and they affect people. In the Arctic, this includes indigenous communities. For Sami and other indigenous peoples in Russia, propaganda is not just about misinformation. It can threaten their work, their activism, and even their personal safety. When state-controlled narratives portray industrial expansion as harmless or inevitable, those who challenge these narratives often face pressure, marginalization, or worse. In that sense, propaganda does not only distort environmental debates, but it can also directly impact human lives. At the same time, this discussion is particularly relevant in the context of the European Union Arctic policy. As the EU prepares to update its Arctic strategy, it's encouraging to see a strong focus on identifying and countering disinformation. This is essential. Strategic decisions must not be based on false narratives promoted from outside actors, in this case Russia, attempting to present industrial and geopolitical ambitions as environmental progress. If policy is built on distorted information, the environmental consequences can be long-lasting and very real. Today's event will explore how Russian state media construct and disseminate misleading narratives about the Arctic and the Northern Sea route, and how these narratives influence international debates. It's truly a pleasure for me to welcome our speakers today. We are fortunate to have a diverse group of experts representing research, investigative journalism, environmental advocacy, and indigenous activism. So we will begin with 4 presentations in a row, and then I will open floor for the question from the audience. And our first speaker is Benjamin Schultz, lead researcher at the American Sunlight Project in Germany. He will speak about Russian disinformation about the Northern Sea route and explain how this narratives are designed and disseminated internationally. Please, Benjamin, welcome.
Super. Oh. Maybe. Yeah.
Can we have presentation of Benjamin?
Quick, everyone, turn around, awkwardly stare. Oh, nope.
Wrong one.
Different one.
But yeah.
That was a good picture, though. This is the one I'm looking forward to. Yes. Super. Awesome. Thank you, Yuri. It's great to be here. I'm glad we have a full room, standing room only. This doesn't happen too often, but note to self, we should book smaller rooms from now on because the audience looks bigger. But awesome. I'm glad to be here. Today I'm going to be talking about a little bit of a study that we did over the last couple of months, examining Kremlin and Russian state media and affiliated media posts about the Northern Sea route. And we'll walk you through some findings and some interesting tidbits. So without wasting too much more time, I'm going to jump in. So before I talk about this, I want to start with some disinformation basics, because this is mostly an Arctic environmental-focused conference, and to be perfectly frank, I'm neither of those an expert in. I'm a disinfo guy. So just to start, Disinformation and misinformation. These two terms are often interchanged, but they actually mean different things. Disinformation means you're spreading information that's somehow malicious with the intent to harm. Misinformation means if my crazy uncle in Florida sees it and reposts it and he didn't know it was false or malicious, he's spreading misinformation without an intent to harm. So I just want to level set with that. So Russian disinformation, right, all the rage these days. A couple notable operations you might have heard of in the news lately, particularly I'm based in Berlin, and I know this has been in the German news of late. There's various different operations, Doppelganger, Matryoshka, Overload, and essentially all of these have a variety of different tactics, some using AI-generated imagery, some basically DDoSing different journalists and outlets with repeated spam, so they waste their time answering spam instead of investigating different things. And of course, in the 2016 election, followed by the 2017 French election, there was a number of different hack and leak operations, some of which were traced back to this internet research agency, which essentially was propping up pro-Black Lives Matter content, pro-Trump content at the same time, and of course, again, the year after in France interfered there as well. In the last year, there's been this new thing called LLM grooming. It's a very interesting phenomenon, and my organization, the American Sunlight Project, has done quite a bit of research into this. Essentially, there's content aggregation networks, one of which is called Pravda, ironically. And essentially, they project millions of pieces of content a year into the ether, across social media, across the internet. And essentially, this content is so plentiful, so high in volume, it gets indexed by Google and cited by chatbots, GPT, Gemini, et cetera. And so I'll touch on that in a bit. That will be important for later. I'll skip, in the interest of time, a couple of these slides and move directly into our study that we've done examining Russian state communications around the development of the Arctic and the Northern Sea Route. What's interesting is that of disinformation around the Arctic, typically more than half of it, and this is a recent study, more than half of it talks about climate change in one way or another, which I think is a pretty expected finding. And our own work with identifying some other disinformation networks traced back to Russia that talk about the environment, they kind of fit into this bucket, talking a lot about climate, conservation, et cetera. But what's interesting, and I'm going to move ahead, what's interesting is that Russian narratives about the Northern Sea Route, they buck this trend. They don't talk about climate. And as Yuri alluded to, and we're going to talk about in the discussion, there's a reason for this. A lot of the narratives from Russian state media talk about economic development, as you might guess. This is a key point. And what's also interesting, I mentioned LLM grooming and the Pravda network. Of the thousands of posts that we've looked at, and I'm going to show you some of them shortly, the overwhelming majority were laundered through this Pravda network. And this is quite important because it's a really new network. It was originally found by the French government, who has done quite extensive reporting on it. And again, of the Russian state media content we've looked at, the majority of it was laundered through this network. And what's interesting about that is that oftentimes there will be a narrative about something else, Ukraine, Ursula von der Leyen, whatever, and information about developing the Arctic and securing Russian economic interests, it's woven into other discussions. And we've seen this kind of pattern before. Okay, so now here's the main event. And I think I'm doing okay on time so far. But what we've done is we've analyzed over 2,000 English language posts mentioning the following terms: Northern Sea Route, Northeast Passage, Transarctic Corridor. And we've collected a sampling of posts from Telegram channels, WhatsApp communities, as well as some alternative platforms, Truth Social, VK, Gab, Getter, Parler, et cetera, as well as about 1,500 posts from X. But due to restrictions with X supplying data for research, we could only analyze these qualitatively. But in total, we've looked at around 4,400 posts from Russian state media and affiliated channels. This is just a quick word cloud. I don't think there's anything too surprising on here, but it's interesting to see it in visual form. Besides taking out the word Russia and the word Trump and like United States, right, these kind of words that appear in every single post, we see some interesting notes here. China is the next most talked about item. Again, I don't think that's so surprising, but it's really by far the largest next term in the set. as well as nuclear icebreaker. I see the word Lula up there, like as in Lula from Brazil. BRICS is mentioned throughout BRICS-related things, as well as economic-focused terms, shipping, containers, etc. And there's three dominant narratives that we've picked up from this set. And again, I don't think this is necessarily surprising, but in terms of mathematically going through each of these 4,400 posts and identifying the key terms and constructing these narratives from that in a systematic, empirical way, we see three primary narratives. That the Northern Sea Route will benefit the world through faster shipping times. Again, not really false if it, in a perfect world, worked out. I think y'all will talk more about that from the environmental perspective. Only Russia possesses the tools and technology to develop the Northern Sea Route safely. That one's a bit questionable. And a new multipolar world order depends on Russia asserting sovereignty in the high... 1 minute, okay. So I'm gonna hurry up. But these are our top narratives that we're seeing from our data set that we've looked at. And I think the key point here is that when we're thinking of where these discussions are placed, again, woven into other topics, we start to think about audience a bit and what the audience might be. A couple of interesting statistics. Year over year, 2024 to 2025, we've seen, so again, I mentioned about 4,400 posts, looking at the same platforms, just going back a year, we see a 200% increase in content mentioning the Northern Sea Route and the terms I mentioned. But what's interesting is that volume decreased by 30%. Why is that interesting? When we look at this phenomenon of LLM grooming, right, the idea is that you project so much into the ether that the audience is not humans, it's LLMs, it's citations and indexing in Google, things like this, so that when people are searching other things, they encounter malign information that might say, oh, we should support economic growth and develop the Arctic, right? Things like this. And so we have to follow up with more research, but it's a very interesting pattern that we've only seen a few times before, and could suggest that the goal here is to influence international conversations in malicious ways through LLM grooming, again, and projecting so much of this content out there that it gets picked up in other conversations, in other fora, so that everyday people who are ingesting other content on the internet might come across malign information. And at the end of the day, as we were just discussing earlier, who's gonna be against economic growth, right? If you're a politician, you're not gonna sit here and say, oh, to save the environment, we should abandon economic growth, right? That's a bad narrative. But when we see this kind of content that is so pro-development, pro-growth, et cetera, it starts to develop a false choice. So
Ben, I need to stop you.
Yeah.
5 seconds to finish.
Nope.
No,
That's
okay. Thank you.
We missed the ball. Okay. Thank you.
So, and our next speaker will be Ksenia Vakhrushev, Project Manager and Arctic Project Advisor at the Bellona Environmental Transparency Center, and will offer a reality check in her presentation, The Northern Sea Route, what to watch out for when reading about the Northern Sea Route. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Yuri. Thanks to everyone who came here in this audience. I hope you remember these three narratives that Benjamin told you about, that he found out during his research, that Russia is trying to push out in the English-speaking media and social media context. So I will try to counteract these messages and show which messages instead of that we should promote from our perspective, from the perspective of the environmental organization Bellona that I'm from. Yeah. Just a little bit add, last year we published the report about the Northern Sea Route, and we saw it as a comprehensive system, not only the shipping lane, but the whole complex around it with mining exploration, oil and gas fields, and the whole symbolic necessity of its development for the Russian government at the moment. I have 2 hard copies here if someone desires them to have in paper, but otherwise you can read it online, of course. Okay, wrong direction. So the first narrative, the Northern Sea Route will benefit the world through faster and cheaper shipping. And I think that everyone here participating in this conference and other similar conferences heard not once that climate change will free up the Arctic waters, and that will ease the way for shipping to go through. We, from our side, think that it's completely not true, because it doesn't, the fact that melting ice on the northern pole will ease the navigation is a false narrative and very simplification of that. In fact, the sea ice will continue to be present along the route, and it's not foreseen in the foreseeable future to have it completely free of ice the whole year round. Floating ice will be still there, but with climate change, the weather conditions will be even more severe. The height of waves will be rising. The coastal degradation will be enormous. So the navigation along the Northern Sea route for ships will be still difficult and very dangerous. So basically, instead of saying that climate change will ease the navigation along the northern part, we should pursue the narrative that as a result of climate change, the navigation along the Northern Sea route will remain difficult and dangerous despite melting ice. So it's not the only prerequisite for opening up the route. And companies who choose to be who choose to use this route will still come across with very important and dangerous obstacles. Like you cannot like 100% calculate the time you need to go through it, because at any moment you can be stuck with ice, which you cannot predict very good in advance. And then it happened even in September, when there is a list month, the month with least coverage of the ice, that unexpectedly ships were trapped in ice and had to wait for icebreakers for a week or 2 weeks or even more. And this is just an example. So this graph here just to remind why Russia wants to develop it. It is used now for export of oil and gas and other minerals from the Russian Arctic. And in Russian plans, it's still the primarily goal for it will be remaining. Russia wants to mine more oil and more gas in the Arctic zone, and necessarily it needs to ship it out. So the whole narrative that it will benefit the global trade is just an additional thing to attract other countries to invest in this route, because Russia is not able to develop it by itself. Later on I will show that there are very difficult financial conditions that restrict Russia from investing enough money in infrastructure and shipbuilding. Yeah, we will publish the slides afterwards, so if you didn't have time to look it through, you will have to afterwards. This is just an example of accidents with ships trapped in ice last year. So the second narrative, that Russia possesses technology and financial sources to develop the route safely. We also conquer that and say that it's not true. First of all, from environmental side, there is no technology in the world right now to clean up oil spills in icy waters timely and effectively. And it's not up to Russia to conquer this narrative, because no country possesses this technology. So the same goes right for safety and search and rescue infrastructure. There won't be enough of it to secure regular commercial shipping in the foreseeable future, not even according to plans of the Russian Federation. Then, yeah, that's the infrastructure plan. That's the icebreakers plan. If you find it interesting, I will answer the questions. And this is the example how Russia do not really clean up spills effectively, even if they happen not far from the coast, but just next to the port in Murmansk. The third narrative, a new multipolar world order depends on Russia asserting sovereignty in the high north. I think this is this should be clear that Russia wants to develop the Northern Sea route to dominate the Arctic and get economic prosperity from selling oil and gas. I think that this shouldn't be supported by other countries because first, drilling oil and gas from the Arctic is completely unsustainable. It drives climate change enormously, and it should be restricted very severely. So with this, instead of joining the Arctic shipping race, as we see it with the recent Arctic strategy, shipping strategy of the US, and other countries wanted to join exploration of the Northern Sea route, I think that we should take measures to prevent intensification of shipping along the Northern Sea route by different means. Very effective measure was banning the new oil and gas exploration projects so that additional ships are not going through the Northern Sea route. And not seeing this route as a potential viable commercial transit from Asian countries to Europe. This is our key messages, which are
And
yes, we don't have time.
Yeah.
Sorry, but yeah, I think you can read them. If you have questions, welcome after.
Thank you, Ksenia. And our next speaker is Andrei Danilov. He is Sami activist and member of the International Committee of Indigenous People. And he will address the influence of propaganda on Sami activists in Russia and speak about how disinformation directly affects indigenous communities. Andrei will speak in Russian and I will translate in English.
Thank you. Boris Terv. Влияние российской пропаганды на коренные народы Арктики.
So the impact of Russian propaganda on the indigenous peoples of the Arctic.
Российские власти активно используют пропаганду и контроль над общественными организациями для формирования нужной повестки в сфере прав коренных народов. Вместо поддержки их интересов государство стремится монополизировать представительство коренных народов на международной арене и подавить независимый активизм внутри России.
Russian authorities actively use propaganda and control over public organizations to shape a preferred narrative on indigenous rights in the Arctic. Instead of supporting indigenous interests, the state seeks to monopolize their representation internationally while suppressing independent activism at home.
Особую роль в этом играет Райпон, организация, которая когда-то защищала права коренных народов, а нынче превратилась в подконтрольную государству структуру.
A central role in the process is played by RAIPON, an organization that once defended indigenous rights but has since turned into a state-controlled structure.
Райпон позиционирует себя как общественная ассоциация, объединяющая 40 коренных народов Севера, Сибири и Дальнего Востока. Однако в последние годы она утратила независимость и фактически стала проводником политики России.
RAIPON presents itself as a nationwide association representing 40 indigenous peoples of the North Siberia and the far east of Russia. In recent years, however, it has lost its independence and effectively became a vehicle for Kremlin policy.
Само присутствие Райпон в международных структурах теперь служит прикрытием для нарушения прав человека внутри России. Как отмечает Дмитрий Бережков, руководитель АСПР, участие Райпон в Арктическом совете лишь легитимизирует позицию Кремля и помогает скрывать нарушения прав коренных народов в самой России.
RAIPON presence in international bodies now serves as a cover for domestic human rights violations. According to Dmitry Berezhkov, head of the International Committee of Indigenous Peoples of Russia, RAIPON's participation in the Arctic Council effectively legitimizes the Kremlin's position and helps obscure rights violations inside Russia.
Российская пропаганда стремится создать на глобальном уровне благополучия коренных народов РФ, подменяя реальность официальными нарративами. Гонго-структуры вроде Райпон играют ключевую роль в этом процессе, выступая на международных мероприятиях от имени всех коренных народов и транслируя выгодные государству нарративы.
Russian propaganda efforts aim to project an image of indigenous well-being in Russia at the global level, replacing reality with official narratives. Gongo structures like Raipon play a key role by speaking at international events on behalf of all indigenous peoples of Russia and promoting state-approved talking points.
На форумах ООН представители Райпон нередко дискредитируют независимых лидеров. Например, на постоянном форуме ООН по вопросам коренных народов в апреле 2023 года делегат Райпон призвал не слушать мнения людей, которые давно уехали из России, да рассуждают о положении дел в стране. Он рекомендовал ориентироваться лишь на организации, действующие в России, заявив, что уехавшие люди дают необоснованную критику политики РФ.
At UN forums, Raipon representatives frequently seek to discredit independent indigenous leaders. For example, at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in April 2023, a Raipon delegate urged participants not to listen to people who left Russia long ago and speculate about the situation in the country. He advised trusting only organizations operating within Russia and dismissed exile voices as offering unfounded criticism of Russian policy.
По сути, Райпон требует признавать легитимным только голос тех, кто, по сути, находится под контролем государства, игнорировать мнения лидеров, вынужденных покинуть страну. Это попытка монополизировать голос коренных народов на международной арене, подменив его официальной версией.
In effect, Raipon argues that only state-controlled voices should be considered legitimate, while leaders forced into exile should be ignored, an attempt to monopolize indigenous representation internationally and replace it with an unofficial version.
Пока на международной арене звучат благостные отчеты Райпон, внутри страны ситуация для низовых экспертов коренных народов становится все более опасной. Кульминацией репрессий стала серия обысков и задержаний 17 декабря 2025 года.
While Raipon delivers reassuring reports abroad, conditions for independent indigenous representatives inside Russia are becoming increasingly dangerous. Repression escalated with a coordinated wave of searches and detentions on December 17, 2025.
В этот день силовики провели одновременные рейды в ряде регионов от Москвы, Санкт-Петербурга, Алтая, Якутия, Мурманской области. Было задержано не менее 17 активистов из числа коренных народов. Многие из них активно сотрудничали с ООН, поднимая экологические и правозащитные проблемы своих общин.
Security forces conducted simultaneous raids across multiple regions, from Moscow and St. Petersburg to Altai, Yakutia, and Murmansk region. At least 17 indigenous activists were detained, many of whom had worked with UN mechanism on environmental and human rights concerns affecting their communities.
Официальным предлогом для этих расправ стали надуманные обвинения в экстремизме и терроризме. Однако правозащитники отмечают, что дела сфабрикованы, а истинная причина преследования – наказание за мирную правозащитную деятельность в структурах ООН.
Authorities justified the crackdown with allegation of extremism and terrorism, claiming links to an organization previously designated extremist. Human rights defenders state that the cases are fabricated and that the real motive is punishment for peaceful advocacy and cooperation with the United Nations.
Показательны судьбы тех, кто затронули эти репрессии. Валентина Совкина, активистка народа Сами, которая является членом постоянного форума ООН, но после многочасового обыска 17 декабря Валентина через 2 дня покинула страну, выехав в Норвегию.
The personal stories are telling. Valentina Sovkina, a Sami activist from the Kola Peninsula and member of the UN Permanent Forum, spent years defending indigenous land rights and criticizing industrial enrichment. After a lengthy search of her home on December 17, she left Russia for Norway 2 days later.
Другой пример. Серкубская активистка Дарья Егорева. В ноябре 2025 года она выступила на конференции ООН по климату КОП-30, рассказывая о разрушении традиционного уклада жизни ее народа из-за действий государственных компаний. Спустя месяц она была арестована по обвинению в терроризме. Теперь ей грозит длительный тюремный срок лишь за то, что она открыто отстаивает права своего народа.
Another example is Selkup activist Daria Yegoreva, who spoke at the UN Climate Conference, COP30, in November 2025, about the destruction of her people's traditional way of life due to state-backed industrial project. projects. A month later, she was arrested on terrorism charges and now faces a long prison sentence for openly defending her community rights.
На этом фоне поведение Райпон выглядит особенно беспринципным. По идее, ассоциация должна была выступиться за своих людей, однако организация хранила молчание, не высказав ни малейшей поддержки, не потребовав обеспечить активистам их права. Когда же Райпон наконец выступила, то лишь для того, чтобы публично отмежеваться, руководство заявило, что не имеет морального права защищать этих людей.
Against this backdrop, Raipon's conduct appears especially unprincipled. The association might have been expecting to defend those detained. Instead, the organization remained silent. When it finally spoke, it publicly distanced itself, stating it had no moral right to defend them.
Характерно, что даже язык международного права используется Райпон в искаженной форме. В ответ на декабрьские аресты активистов Райпон сослалась на Декларацию ООН о правах коренных народов не для защиты своих же народов, а для того, чтобы оправдать свое бездействие, фактически ставя лояльность государству выше прав человека. Это подрывает инструмент защиты прав, инструмент подавления, подрывает доверие к международным нормам.
Notably, even the language of international law is used by Raipon in a distorted way. In response to the December arrests of activist Raipon cited the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples not to defend indigenous communities, but to justify its own inaction, placing loyalty to the state above human rights. A rights protection instrument is thus turned into a tool of suppression, undermining trust in international norms.
Организация, признана представлять коренные народы, отказалась от них в тот момент, когда они наиболее нуждались в защите, тем самым поставилась лояльность властям выше собственного долга. Если структура жертвует своими людьми ради собственного выживания, она перестает быть их настоящим представителем.
An organization established to represent indigenous peoples refused them support at their most vulnerable moment, placing loyalty to authorities above its own mandate. A body that sacrifices its people for its own survival ceases to be their true representative.
Действия российской пропаганды и подконтрольных ей организаций несут серьезные последствия для коренных народов Арктики.
The combined effect of state propaganda and state-aligned organizations carries serious consequences for Arctic indigenous peoples.
Во-первых, искажается сама реальность. Официальные выступления Райпон рисуют благополучие, когда как на местах обостряются проблемы. Промышленное загрязнение земель, ограничения для традиционного охотничьего рыболовного промысла, угасание языков и культуры.
First, reality itself becomes distorted. Official statements portray stability and success, while on the ground, communities face worsening conditions, industrial pollution, restriction on traditional hunting and fishing, and the erosion of languages and cultures.
Во-вторых, такая политика ведет к расколу и угасанию доверия внутри самих коренных сообществ. Когда единственная официальная организация превращается в инструмент власти, независимые лидеры либо вынуждены молчать, либо эмигрируют. Это подрывает способность коренных народов в солидарности отстаивать свои права.
Second, trust within indigenous communities erodes. When the only officially recognized organization becomes an arm of the state, independent leaders are forced into silence or exile. Collective rights advocacy becomes harder to sustain.
Возникает кризис представительства на международном уровне. Ситуация перерастает в вызов для международных институтов. Ведь глобальная система защиты прав коренных народов рискует быть скомпрометирована, если вместо реальных представителей на трибуну выйдут ширмы от государства.
Third, a crisis of representation emerged internationally. A global rights institution risks being compromised if state proxies rather than genuine representatives occupy international platforms.
Наконец, страдают конкретные люди, носители языков, хранители культур, защитники родных земель. Их преследует не только удар по личным судьбам, но и угроза будущего целых народов. Когда пропаганда объявляет таких активистов врагами и лишает их голоса, все сообщество теряет своих лучших представителей.
Finally, real people suffer. Language keepers, cultural carriers, defenders of ancestral lands. Their persecution threatens not only individual lives, but the future of entire peoples. When propaganda brands such figures as enemies and strips them of voice, communities lose their strongest advocates.
Кихту, спасибо. Тюсин так.
Thank you. So, and our next speaker is Lyubov Velichko, freelance investigative journalist from Ukraine, will tell us about Russian disinformation in the Arctic, sharing insights from investigative work on how these narratives are constructed and amplified. Please.
Thank you. Hello to everyone. Usually I make masterclass during 1.5 hours on this topic, but I have only 7 minutes. That is why I will raise only one question, which is why Russian disinformation campaigns are so effective. And I will give you 3 tactics which explains why they are so effective. So let's start from the paradox. Right now in the Arctic, because of the climate crisis, male white polar bears are hunting babies of polar bears because they are hungry. And that is a scientific fact. And that is why I was very surprised when I once found a financial report of one company. And I want you to guess which company uses the image of white polar bear on these annual financial reports. Any ideas? No ideas. Okay. I will not make you struggle. Rosneft, the largest oil and gas company in Russia. And I was wondering why the biggest polluter uses a bear for the first page of this financial report. And the answer is because the first tactic is a greenwashing. So basically they had a very light reason to use the bear on the first page of the financial report. That is because they are so kind that they are taking care of 30 polar bears which lives in the zoos of Russian Federation. So the company is so generous that it buys food for the polar bears who lives in zoos. That is why they are claiming they are taking care of polar bears. And also, they're giving some money for scientists who are making researches about polar bears. But of course, these researches are nothing to compare about the topic of influence of oil and gas companies to climate change. The second tactics is a financial reason why so many institutions, scientists in Russian Federation do not cover the topic of climate crisis in frames of research how oil and gas activities influencing on Russia Federation and Arctic, for example. It's because they are giving money for these researchers and institutes, and the amount you can see it's only from 2 companies. It's from Rosneft and Gazprom. And it means if we will calculate much more companies, the amount of scientific institutions will be much, much bigger. So what the scientists from that organizations do, they make investigations and scientific researches not connected with the climate and Arctic. They're making researches about wherever, but not about these topics. I was very, very surprised when I found out which topics are financed by Rosneft and Gazprom. And some of them sounds very ridiculous, like the shape of iceberg or the amount of poo of polar bear. I'm not joking right now. So the idea is to make the scientists to be dependent from the companies, so they don't want to make any investigations about these companies because they receive money from them, which is obvious. And the very interesting fact is that the amount of money which Rosneft and Gazprom spend for these activities to finance scientific researches of institutes, which, as you can see, is less than 1%, much, much less than 1% of their profit, annual profit. So the impact of the activities is huge, while they don't need to spend a lot of money in Russia. By the way, as you may know, Russian scientists, they don't earn so much money as scientists in the US, for example, or European Union. That is why you don't need to spend millions and hundreds of millions of dollars to grab them. And the third tactics is that they use a very well-known institutions and people who are leaders of the institutions in the scientific area in Russia to make them members of the board of the companies like Rosneft and Gazprom. So why do they do this? First of all, because they want these people to be presented on the biggest conferences in the world, for example, COP, to to be their lobbyists, but not saying that they are lobbyists of Rosneft and Gazprom. So basically what happens is a very well-known and respected scientist from one of these institutions come to the conference with a big panel and promotes the ideas which is very fits to the interests of Rosneft and Gazprom. And they don't mention that, oh, by the way, we are promoting this idea because we are members of the board of this company, and we are basically interested not in independent researchers, scientific researchers, but because we want to help Russia to make it goals on the international arena. How is timing?
You have 2 more minutes.
Oh, I'm very effective. Okay. Yeah, and then I will add that this tactic is used not only by Russia, but by other biggest oil and gas companies in the world. This is only the part of the infographics I made in frames of investigation how top managers of biggest polluters are connected with the scientific researchers. On the corner you can see WWF, you see? Which is hidden on this photo is that the director, the ex-director of WWF right now is one of the top managers of Shell, for example. And of course, it's very useful to use her reputation and her connections in the scientific and NGO like society to promote the ideas, the company where she right now works. So that is why it would be very good if when we seen the panels on these biggest conferences and seeing the names of the participants, we need to properly see if they are connected somehow with real polluters. And that is why these investigations need to be done not only by investigative journalists, but by the governments of countries who wants to really do something to fight with the disinformation, which is heavily spreaded recently. Thank you for your attention. I will be happy to answer all your questions.
Yes, thank you, Lyubov, and you save us a couple of minutes for questions. So, and any questions from the audience? Here, please, the first one.
Thank you very much. I'm James Gray. I'm a British parliamentarian. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's extremely interesting. I'm just a little bit puzzled, however. Most of what you described was what I describe as PR or spin. It's perfectly true that people advance their arguments by using all sorts of methods in the West as in Russia, but none of it seemed to me to be very wicked. Taking one example, your talk, for example, about the Northern Sea Route, some people think the Northern Sea Route is a very good thing, other people think it's a very bad thing. That's an argument that mariners and scientists can have, but I'm not sure it's a matter of propaganda. I was wondering, could you perhaps enlighten me one thing? Who are Bellona and who funds you?
Ksenia?
Yeah, that's an easy question. Bellona is an international environmental organization working with since 1986, headquarters in Norway, and we have offices in Brussels, Berlin, and Lithuania. The variety of funding is rather diverse. We have we're funded from European Union programs, Norwegian government, different private charity foundations, private sector donations. So the full list is on our website. You're free to go there and check. But you have a good question, actually. And I will ask Benjamin to answer the first part of it, why it's actually propaganda and not just PR as we think it's a harmless PR.
Super. Thanks for the question. And I think you make a good point, right? That we all have an opinion on every issue under the sun. And, you know, to that extent, we all have the right to have an opinion. I kind of ran out of time, but I think the biggest point that I would make in response is in terms of the study that I did with the pieces of content from the Russian government affiliated channels. Really what I'm looking at that concerns me is tactics. When we have known vectors like this Pravda network, which was found by Visionum, which is a agency of the French government, and it's been found by other partners and civil society organizations that this Pravda network is a particularly potent vector for disinformation about many things, from, yes, the environment to Ukraine, etc. And when we see that the majority of content talking about the Northern Sea route, perpetuating myths that Ksenia talked about and debunked, and when we see that the majority of this content is going through this Pravda network, that to me, as a disinformation expert, is quite problematic. People's opinions aside, when we start to look at manipulative tactics and ways to project false content out there, that's a problem. And so that would be my response in terms of propaganda, totally recognizing that there are a variety of opinions on the environment and all of these issues under the sun. I'm not an environment guy myself, but again, we like to think of ourselves, at least in my work, as somewhat actor agnostic, more looking at tactics.
Thank you, Ben. And we have another question then. And
just
okay.
very quick. Beside my solidarity and vicinity to the Sami issue, because this happens also in Italy, where people get arrested just because they try to protect their land, and they are called terrorists for this. So this happens almost everywhere in the world when you try to save your land. So it's not a matter of Russia. I wonder if this panel considered inviting a representative of Russia here.
We are Russians, so.
Just to make it clear, I am Russian citizen. I lived in Russia for 28 years since my birth. Then I relocated because of the threats from the Russian government. Yuri is a Russian citizen who lived in Russia for 30 plus years, who relocated to Lithuania in 2022 after the full-scale invasion. Andrei is a Russian citizen. He is Sami, but he was born in Murmansk. He relocated in 2022 because of the threat from the Russian government. And Bellona, as an environmental organization, is an undesirable organization in Russia. And we continue working for it. We're criminal offenders in Russia. It's a criminal case to work for this environmental organization. We used to work on it in St. Petersburg and in Murmansk. I'm from St. Petersburg. Yuri is from Murmansk. So we worked for Bellona there for the prosperity and environment in the Russian Federation. We tried to work with the government. We tried to work with the scientific communities. We a lot worked with grassroots organizations across Russia. But we were pushed out. And now we continue our research and our mission to make you aware of what's really happening there. So we continue our research on Russian Federation, unfortunately from outside, because it's not possible to do it independently from inside.
And we have one more question.
Thank you for your presentations. I just want to make a question on how do you evaluate the effectivity of the Russian propaganda? Just out of the expertise, so I just wanted to know more.
Short answer is it's huge. And I'm very happy that you are all here, because alone by myself, being investigative journalist, I felt so helpless making these investigations, knowing the truth. And because the impact is huge, we need to all work together to do something to stop the influence. Because right now, for example, Russia uses the topic of nuclear plants as a topic of clean energy. And this was the Russian disinformation, like FIMI operation, like foreign informational operation, started in late 2021, And it was so effective that right now the World Bank, first time since 1950s, agreed to finance the building of nuclear plants. And guess who will receive money to building these plants? Yes, you're right. Rosatom is the only one company in the world who has no real competitors who can build and who can give the fuel and expertise and etc. It's a brilliant Russian operation, and no one mentioned that it was made.
I would follow up with one other example, perhaps, of effectiveness. So I talk about this LLM grooming stuff, and I know it's kind of an abstract concept, but we're working on a follow-up study right now to one we put out last year, which is not necessarily about the environment, climate, et cetera, but more about Ukraine at the moment. And we're still going through the numbers, we're still doing some testing, but we can estimate very conservatively that across the EU and the US, that in terms of actual direct propaganda from Sputnik, RT, whatever, projected and then cited by GPT, et cetera, we can conservatively estimate that hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people in the US and in the EU are exposed to this content. Now, how many of them see the citation in a chatbot and then actually click it and believe it? I don't know. That's really quite impossible to measure. But at the very least, we can conservatively estimate that hundreds of thousands of people see propaganda from all sides of the spectrum, all issues, whatever. You know, again, how many people believe it, interact with it, whatever, I don't know. But, you know, at a conservative estimate, it's pretty effective, at least in terms of getting the message out there.
Я хочу добавить одну новость.
I want to add one more news.
Вчера в средствах массовой информации России прошла новость,
Yesterday in mass media of Russia there was presented a news
что на земле Сами уже в этом году откроется огромная фабрика по добыче лития.
that on the Sami land already this year will be open a huge plant of mining the lithium.
Мы ведем 4 года борьбу против этой компании.
We're fighting 4 years against this company.
Эта компания создана Росатомом и Норникелем.
This company created by Rosatom and Nornickel.
Мы подавали Норникель, обращались к Илону Маску. Обращались к Илону Маску.
We claim we sent a letter to Elon Musk, okay?
Твиттер. Илон Маск не заключил контракт с Норильским никелем.
And Elon Musk decided not to sign a contract with Norilsk Nickel.
Я надеюсь, что другие компании мира тоже не будут заключать компании ни Роснефтью, ни Росатомом, ни с другими российскими компаниями, деньги которых идут на войну.
And I hope that not any company in the world will sign a contract with Rosatom, Rosneft, Nornickel, and other Russian companies which money funds the war in Ukraine. Okay, we have a question and a couple of more minutes. Okay.
Hello, thank you. Works? Yeah.
Yeah, it works.
Thanks for the presentation. I try to play the devil's advocate. I understand that Russia is doing a lot of disinformation on climate change, which is affecting the Arctic. But as you know, also the Western countries, the US, Europe, are doing a lot of greenwashing, biofuel, supply chains, ESG, greenwashing, finance, and whatsoever. How you can measure actually the impact of the Russian disinformation on climate change over the Western disinformation campaign, let alone Trump denial of climate change? How you can measure impact? That's the ultimate outcome. Which is the worst greenwashing, the Russian or the Western?
Okay. We have American here, so Ben Любовь, who will answer?
I will answer, but you understand my motivation. For me personally, Russia is the bigger threat because Russia is an enemy and a very, very aggressive. And I would be aware to have the enemy like that. And I would not help the enemy to get more money to finance the enemy in any way. That is why, for me, I don't want to compare like what is worse to have the disinformation from Western company or from Russia, because for me, it's more safe when Western company receives the money, because I know that it will not spend this money to kill somebody physically.
Yeah, I want to follow up with this question. Of course, it's not only Russia spreading disinformation, and it is difficult to measure exact percentage of impact from this or that disinformation tactics or source of disinformation. But the whole approach of spending enormous amount of money on trolls fabrics, who are just copy-paste the comments in social media. It didn't start in 2022. It didn't start in 2014. It started much earlier in Russia. And then it spread further. And even now, in countries of Western Europe, Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, we see the roots of Russian sources in the disinformation spread about the local politics, about climate, and about other stuff. If you dig further, you still find the Russian traces. So this is one of the roots which started this, and unfortunately, it was taken by other countries as well. And now it's the whole mass of different countries and actors spreading different bullshit.
I think you both, yeah. Just to add on, I'll go along with devil's advocate. I think when we talk about the Arctic and we talk about the high north today, certainly there's not nearly enough attention on Trump's threats against Greenland, against these, U.S. allegedly, these U.S. think tanks and whatnot that are going to be popping up across Europe to advance the positions of the administration. No one's talking about this. That's happening, and so I think to at least from that perspective, lately directly impacting the Arctic and sovereignty. I think that not nearly enough people are talking about the administration's threats against Greenland, et cetera. Again, I'm not an environment climate guy, so I guess I'll pass slightly on that, but understandable, the devil's advocate.
Thank you. So we were expecting some debates on our topic, and I'm glad that they happened. So if we still have some questions or controversial discussions, so I invite you to join our speakers on a coffee break and continue questioning them. But for now, thank you for your time and for being with us today, and give a big round of applause to our speakers.